Hello everybody. Again, I try now to focus on, the proposals at hand. So obviously one of the proposals, how to handle the situation we have somewhat touched yesterday, is the promise of some say green capitalism, some mention it Green New Deal, and those who are the most honest speak about green growth. Actually, it's the same, but depending on the institutions, they mention it differently. So I will first, very shortly, refer to these promises, and then present very shortly also some arguments which question these promises, before elaborating on a number of obstacles that have to be taken into consideration when shifting to renewable energy technology, because this obviously is in the heart of this promise, including also a discussion of very serious trade-offs, which are simply not easy to overcome. Before then, ending with a number of conclusions, and finally, if time allows, hopefully I try to skip as short so that we really can also have a discussion on my last part, which is a proposal for a discussion on socially desirable goals, how to organize this transformation. And I'm pretty sure this time it will be definitely a European view, and I'm really very interested to learn from you how you would schedule these norms and views which I will present to you, because I'm sure that this is not, this cannot be transformed or used one-to-one in a different context, such as South Africa. So, as I said, this green narrative, let's call it green narrative because it includes then everything. There are very different wordings. It's all taking the threat of climate change into account and resource scarcity, even though we have not discussed yesterday that much about resource scarcity, but I guess you have an idea what it is. And the objective always is decarbonization of the global economy. I gave you here some institutions who use this concept, and the notion of the United Nations Environment Programme. It's a green economy, and there the focus is placed on an active state intervening in order to achieve green growth and on a better valuing and commercializing of nature. This actually is really in the center of the UNEP approach. While OECD, which is, as you know, a think tank of the advanced industrial countries, also World Bank, they are focusing on sustainable development and green growth, so they are a little bit more honest, speaking about the growth agenda. They have a much stronger focus on the potential amount of jobs that could be created in the fields of renewable energy generation and distribution. While the G20 use the term Green New Deal, as also some advanced industrial countries do, while the ILO, the International Labour Organization, focus exclusively on the aspect of sustainable development and green jobs which could be created, while in the European Union we have as an additional aspect the so-called bioeconomy. I can leave it aside because it's not really relevant for our discussion here. So the common concern is that in order to avoid inefficient use of scarce resources and at the same time increase efficiency through technological innovation and changing consumption pattern. However, all these projections agree that a green agenda would be a growth agenda. This is something we really should not forget when referring to this. Well, let me first before I come, yes, I can already move to this. So the core message, if I really try to conclude, what is in these huge papers, so you have really masses of papers on this issue. So The win-win promise is the following one: investment into the energy sector, as well as in public infrastructure and environmental protection, will first create additional jobs and at the same time create low-carbon infrastructures and increase national energy security by reducing the reliance. That's in particular the case for European countries, but not only, the reliance on energy and raw material imports. So this is also a promise going more into the security issue. So let's deal with it, because our energy security makes us stronger as a nation if we become independent from import, or more, less dependent on import. In the case of the industrialized countries, there's an additional expectation, which very rarely is mentioned, namely that this could also create a competitive advantage through technological leadership. And this is an aspect one should not forget. You know, when these institutions more focusing on industrialized countries speak about green growth, they always have in mind, well, those countries who develop the technologies will have an advantage because they will be able to sell. So obviously we can talk about this later. The European Union is in a very difficult situation, because in the meantime the Chinese solar panels are much cheaper than the European ones. So the market to a huge amount has been captured by Chinese corporations. I will later refer to one explanation for this. But anyhow, one can say what is expected is that everybody would be better off. So new investment opportunities would create profits for business. At the same time, workers could look for new and even higher paid jobs, even higher quality jobs. So the income would rise and they could spend more on consumption, and therefore we had this wonderful growth mechanism reinstalled. And government could hope for to reduce debt levels, what we mentioned yesterday, so also this is an idea behind. And yes, by the way, also the environment would be protected, and future generations could look out for a life worth living, in a way. So one could extend on this more, but actually this is the core of the promise somehow. I put it here in a kind of conclusion: intelligent macroeconomic policy, which is public spending, but on the right things, technological advances. The idea is that new products, new processes, and new services can increase growth, but also better management, better institution. You know, this is what the international institution always recommend then to developing countries and countries in the global south. So you need better institutions, and then you can also profit from this tendency toward green growth, but also some sort of government intervention. And this is a topic which is somehow split, so not everybody is really enthusiastic about more government intervention, because interventions, I came back on this later, might not only be rule-making, but might also include some bans on something. And this is not really the idea that government should intervene in terms of banning something, but it should be all based on a market approach, so stimulating business to do the right things, and government should help business to do so, but not intervening into business affairs. Well, and yes, there could be unavoidable externalities, but well, somehow they will somehow be solved, and government intervention should stay at the minimum necessary. But the promise is there could be, and this is a very important wording, a dematerialization of production. Dematerialization, which is absolutely stupid, you know, before the background what I discussed yesterday, you know, as if we can do anything out of nothing, you know. If I would dematerialize this table to such an extent, you know, that let's say half of the material, it's wood, no, not really wood, maybe plastic and steel, is no longer in it, nobody would really use the table or the chair anymore because it will break down. So the idea of dematerialization, but you find it everywhere. So as if you can organize living on planet Earth without using, so consuming, destroying, transforming materials. But this is a promise, dematerialization, as if we can simply live from nothing. Yes. I want to be a little bit quicker. So, well, no, before I go to this, I will ask you, first, before I come with my consideration and arguments against this green growth promise. When you hear this, you have heard about this already, you know, and while you read it in the newspaper and Green New Deal, it sounds really nice. What are your own reservations with regard to this? Or are you simply convinced that yes, if it's properly done, this could really be the solution? So before I go ahead and, you know, overthrow you with my argument why this is so complicated. You have heard about, and I guess, normally people are not really hostile towards this perspective. Oh.
Well, it's better than what it is now, the idea of it.
The idea would be better. So, but what within this idea is something which convinces you?
Well, I just think the cradle-to-cradle approach, where you start thinking of the whole loop of a production system, is not currently considered in making things. So that's a step in the right direction. If our tables aren't going to fall apart, with what we make things out in the future.
Okay. Can other participants help? So what is it really, what, you know, as a kind of substance is convincing for you? So, well, this is an element where I really believe this could stimulate something positive.
I suppose at the core of the calculus is the fact that while we recognize that there is a finite amount of resources at our disposal, we also have the Malthusian calculus that we're going to get to 9 billion and so on. And so everybody recognizes that and recognizes the need to better utilize the resources at our disposal.
Yeah.
I think more and more people are getting converted mainly by that fear, even though they know that it is more convenient to say use and throw stuff away. We can see that we are getting to the tipping point, and it is actually that fear that is converting the majority of people.
Are there other arguments why you think, well, in the core of this green approach, this promise, there is something which is really convincing for me? So maybe. So, no, it's this. So when you look at this, I try to summarize the core messages. So, you know, macroeconomic policy, public infrastructure investment, technological advances, plus market-based instruments, including something like emission certificates, carbon capture and storage, the clean development mechanism, which is already there now, but I put it here because it was there. Green investment in renewable energy technologies, and finally also ecosystem services and its financing. So actually these are the, let's say, the instruments which are proposed for this Green New Deal, and while the promise I have already mentioned, yes, new jobs and less carbon and stuff like this. But first one should reflect a little bit about these instruments. Do you really think that these instruments which are at the disposal or on the table, that they really are sufficient to reach, you know, what you have in mind in terms of expectation? Because these aren't the core instruments they propose.
So for me, it's just two questions I'm asking myself. Does this resolve the biophysical limits? So that's the one question I'm asking myself. To test the efficacy of these instruments, do they get to the heart of the systemic problems? And the other question is, does this break with neoliberalism and the neoliberal financialized paradigm. So I'm asking myself.
No, this is nobody is promising that this will break neoliberalism, because it's taken as an approach within capitalism, make capitalism greener, to stay with the system, because everybody is afraid, what could come after. So it's a promise. We don't have to change the system. We can make the system greener via these instruments, and then our problems will be solved. And there's a charm in it, because everybody who has this idea, well, obviously we are approaching some sort of tipping point. It's better than nothing. But when you have a closer look at the instruments at the disposal, you can already be quite skeptical before going in more. But I will not do more detail. The shortcomings and the trade-offs which are included in the approach, but even at a first glance, one can see these are quite old instruments. They are can really these instruments. So, for instance, the emission certificate trading. Everybody knows that is pandemic cheating. Corporation had made a big bargain. But CO2 emissions are going up. So the old instruments are coming up again and again. Emissions today have a price which is simply ridiculous. You can avoid taxes very easily by buying and selling these certificates. So everybody knows that this is an instrument which is not working, but still it's there. And yes, and the core of the promise, and this is something which is something one should take seriously, is obviously, the promise we should move to renewable energy technologies in order to provide cleaner energy, because even though with renewable energy we first only provide electricity, and electricity we cannot eat. So we know that electricity is not the whole story, but at least it would be a step in the right direction. Therefore, nobody is really against it. But I want first to discuss with you, or give you some of these. I made it as shortly, as briefly as possible. So one of the promises, it could be a decoupling of economic growth and CO2 emissions, as well as resource consumption. So the promise is we can still grow, but we can grow without emitting as many CO2 or other gases. It's not only CO2, it's also methane and so on. We can grow while emitting less, plus also consuming less raw materials. And this goes under the heading of decoupling economic growth from resource extraction and from CO2 emission. So I want to give you here 3 arguments why this is simply impossible. And for those who want to read a little bit more about this, nothing here. Tim Jackson, which is a British Tim Jackson has done these quite nice calculations. Also the graph I will show you in a second is from his book, where you can see, but there's also the new Economic Institute in Britain with a wonderful report proving that this is not possible. Decoupling is not possible. Why it's not possible? So the first argument is the so-called Jevons Paradox. Jevons was an economist who lived at the time when coal energy was substituting wood, and what he discovered was, at first glance, there was an increase in efficiency on the basis of this new energy source, coal, which then lowers the prices, so you can increase efficiency while using coal compared to wood, or charcoal, to be more precise. But this will lower the price, and this is something you want to have. But the point is, when you lower the prices, was his paradox, then demand is increasing. Because, there is consumption power set free, and businesses will invest in other activities while households spend on other products, maybe on the same product or on other products. But as a result, you don't have less of the resource consumed, but even more. And this argument that efficiency increases, so when I have to spend less on energy, so let's assume renewable energy would be less expensive. I come later back on some arguments why this is not necessarily the case. But let's assume, on the long run, one can definitely say it will be less expensive. But the point is, and you can see it very easily in countries where there is already quite impressive amount of renewable energy consumption now, and I don't pay that much for it, except of some political regulations, but it's not really that it in itself is expensive, but the money which is saved is spent for other things or for the same. So it's the argument, if you have a car which consumes less fuel, you are driving longer or more often. And if you have a fridge who consumes less energy, interesting enough, what happens with your old fridge? It moves to your land house or your little garden or to other places or into the cellar where you use it in addition to the old fridge you have. So this is proven with a lot of things. So this is called the Rebound Effect or Jevons Paradox, namely that if households' income is freed, it's not that less is consumed, maybe from the one source, let's say energy, but more is consumed from other sources. So, and in the balance you will have not a decrease in CO2 emissions, and the second argument, I will just give you a graph where you can see it, and the second argument is that empirically, when you look at those countries who have already started a considerable amount of in feeding in energy from renewable energy sources, you can see that nowhere economic growth really has been absolutely decoupled from resource consumption and CO2 emission. What you can see that there is a relative decoupling, but not an absolute one. And this relative one you can see here. That's taken from this Jackson book. You can see here, the green is natural gas, the blue is coal, the yellow is oil, and this is CO2 emission. In order to make it more easy to read for you, you can see what relative decoupling means is, so obviously, no matter whether we use renewable energy or not, emissions are going up, oil consumption is going up, everything is going up. So growth is happening, and relative decoupling means that, compared to the amount of CO2 in relation to the growth you had at this time in the middle of the 90s, yes, it has grown, but relative, so because growth is a little bit more than this, you can say there is less CO2 emission in relation to economic growth, so relatively there is a decoupling, but this doesn't really help us. If growth is going on, as I have shown you yesterday. So relative decoupling is possible, but absolutely decoupling is not. The problem is, empirically, this decoupling took place mainly around the 90s. And what happened around the beginning of the early 90s? Do you remember? Something very important world history of the 20th century. It's not only the wall, you know, the whole Soviet Union system collapsed. And so industries in such a huge amount collapsed, and this definitely caused the decrease of CO2 emissions. So this wonderful role, for instance, Germany played always, you know, as a forerunner in renewable energy, stuff like this. It has simply to do with the fact that since all the industry in East Germany broke down, yes, for a particular period of time, there were less CO2 emissions, but in the meantime, we were very successful in catching up again. So, and this has to be taken seriously as an argument. Do I have another? Ah, yeah, as this, I wonder whether I have this graph. And what is very interesting, this I've taken from a very critical institute, the Breakthrough Institute. What you can see here, these are carbon intensity of growth, so it's the same relation somehow. And what you see here, so here we have the signing of the Kyoto Protocol, you know, where in a first step countries oblige themselves to reduce CO2 emissions. And what is very interesting with this graph, you can see before the decrease in emission were even stronger than after the signing of the protocol. You know, and this had to do with developments. This is not energy saving or stuff like this. You know, it's simply breakdown of they had the crisis in Southeast Asia. You had a crisis in Russia and in Argentina. And so on, you know, and you know, in times of crisis, obviously, you have less growth, and therefore you have also less emission. And this I find very interesting. So, looking at, you know, the overall framework, you can say, well, actually, the signing of the protocol not really impacted in a quite positive sense. So,
Birgit, the little dip there around 2009, 2010. Is that also attributable to the...
Sure. This is a crisis we discussed yesterday. You know, when you have a long-term recession well, depends whether you say it's 10 years, it's 5 years, depends a little bit, but at least 5 years. We had this recession. Some would argue we still are still in some places of the world, we're still at the end of this recession, but this obviously is a crisis here, you know, and so you can say when you have less growth, then you have less CO2 emission, you know, and when you have growth, you have more CO2 emissions. So this is simply the case, and the question is now, which role could a green policy play? Obviously not with the instrument mentioned before, because these instruments really have not really that much impact. So I want to give you also, even though I will not elaborate longer on this case, but since I have distributed an article which is dealing mostly with the European Union for a long time, European Union policy has been taken as a best case example, because in the so-called Lisbon Treaty, the Lisbon strategy attached to it, it was the first time that energy policy and environmental policy were combined. And at the very end of my lecture, I will come back on some challenges referring to policy frameworks. And one framework I will later mention is that you really have to put the issue of, you know, decarbonizing into all policy fields. You know, into all policy fields, from education to economic to environment. At least European Union, and not place it in an environmental department, which is absolutely ridiculous. At least European Union understand that you have to bring energy policy and environmental policy close together, and therefore they had first a quite challenging approach, but actually this approach later has been changed into this so-called EU 2020 agenda, knowing that 2020 is next year, where definitely much more priority was given to growth instead of green. But you know, how can we succeed in organizing growth and jobs? And it would be good if the growth would be green and the jobs would be green, but this is a priority. They have strictly given prevalence to a cost-benefit approach, meaning only this should be done, which really turns out in the way that it will reduce cost for companies, you know, and everything which could increase cost for companies, this should not be a policy recommended to the member states. Thirdly, competition in this new approach, this EU 2020 agenda, is supposed to be the most effective method of innovative discovery. So not regulation by the state, by government, or by other institutions, but competition. And competition, I will come back on this later, as long as you have a dominant brown industry, so fossil fuel industry, and you let competition do the job, it's always clear that green will lose, because for the brown industries, for the brown energy production, infrastructure is already there. You don't have to finance it right now, even though it might need some maintenance, as in South Africa, obviously, is needed, but nevertheless, the infrastructure is there, while when you let competition do the job, the green will always lose out, because you first have to build up the infrastructure, you know, the grids and all this stuff. So competition is really a very problematic element, because you will not easily succeed. One German social democrat and two green members of parliament once passed a law in the German parliament which became famous across the world, because now, I don't know, maybe 150 countries using this feed-in tariff system. Do you know what it is? So it is the idea to trick out competition. Say, well, actually we are in a market society, and yes, competition should do the job, but we first have to organize a situation where really brown and green can compete with each other. And as long as this is not the case, you know, those who are installing solar or other solar power, wind energy, should get a special tariffs subsidizing these providers, so that if the competition is really set up, let's say, if they are 50-50 in terms of competition, then we can let the market do the job. This has been passed through German parliament in a second, when our chancellor at this time, Mr. Schröder, was so occupied with the question whether to engage in the Iraq war or not, that he simply missed the opportunity to intervene. And therefore we had this wonderful law which really changed things a lot. This also gives you a hint for our discussion later, that you always need something like windows of opportunity, where good politicians can identify, now it's a point where I can push through something which was not possible to push through before. Might be that most of my colleagues don't understand what they are now accepting, but this is something where you can really see that intelligent politician can change things. So to make us a little bit more optimistic, this is the reason why I mentioned this, not because it was a German law, but to give you the idea that if there are people, and Hermann Schell, who was the one who was working for this since 20 years, you know, and he did not engage in the other horrible policy of German social democracy. You know, he was a good friend of us, and we always discussed with him, so Hermann, how can you stand in this party which does such a horrible social policy? And say, well, sorry, I have a name. I know what I want, you know, and they will leave me only doing this. I'm the only expert, and they will leave me. They will let me do the job only if I don't intervene in their competences. And even though I never understand this view, in the final end he was right, because otherwise he would have been engaged in so many other struggles where he was less competent than in this one. So this gives you an idea that it's very necessary. So I want to make it shorter, I have to make it shorter. So the point was, in this EU 2020 strategy, even though it was already a very market conformist approach, but at least there were binding targets for all the member states formulated. So member states were forced to reduce, to have at least 20% renewable energy until 2020. To have, I don't want to give you the other binding goals. These binding goals have been agreed, but the problem is we have now 2020. And the renegotiation, which happened last year and the year before, had the wonderful result that from now on we have no binding target anymore. So, second thing which is necessary to learn from this European experience, only if you have binding agreements, so force other states as well as yourself to fulfill promises and to organize some sort of punishment for the situation where, fulfillment cannot be identified, only then you will have a change. So what is happening in the meantime in the European Union, also, the Eastern European member states, they go ahead with coal, 80% coal in our neighboring country, Poland. The French go ahead with nuclear energy, even though they changed now a little bit more to renewable energy. And also Germany is not fulfilling its goal because we have also quite a number of communities depending on the taxes from coal-fired plant, from energy corporation, from coal-fired plants, even though we have in Germany only 30,000 people still working in these plants. So it would be a very easy thing to change this, but still there is now nothing going on anymore. Secondly, this argument of so-called technological neutrality is a very problematic one. The argument says, no, we don't care how you fulfill this amount of non-fossil fuels. You can do this with nuclear energy, you can do this with water, you can do this with carbon capture and storage, you can do it with any sort of technology as long as CO2 emissions are reduced. And this is also not the best way. You have to really prescribe, because these other technologies have their shortcomings as well, and therefore, it's not only about CO2 emission, it's also about going in the right way and not only reduce CO2 emissions. Plus, the competition principle is still very top on the agenda, plus the support for the so-called energy-intensive industries. And this is really the most problematic aspect, because, for instance, Germany, we have only energy-intensive industries on which we build our economic access. The car industry, the steel industry, well, steel industry is no more that important, but car industry, the chemical industry, and the machine industry. And this is something, if you exclude all these industries and simply focusing on the energy sector, this is absolutely stupid, then you will not do any step forward. So, to make this long story about the European Union short, green growth for the European Union is a business case, meaning as long as it helps us as a whole European Union to develop technologies which can be exported elsewhere. It's not only Germany, even small Hungary is exporting quite a lot of wind power technology. So there are a lot of member states in the European Union who can profit on the basis of green technology development and exporting this abroad. As long as this is the case, one can say European Union is a good case example for a green growth strategy, but this is obviously not really helping us in the dimension we have discussed yesterday. Now I would move to some more basic problems. The first part is about, kind of very ambivalent framing of policy and not very convincing approach, I think so. But what I now address are more problematic, are more serious issues insofar as they are not easy to overcome, even not by, well, sorts of progressive, left of green, whatever governments. The first thing is the lower EROI. Does anybody in the room knows what EROI stands?
Energy return on...
Energy return on energy invested. In capitalism, we can also say energy return on capital invested because it's somehow the same. So I will explain it to you in a second. It's the energy you need to extract, let's say, a ton of energy, because you can never do anything without nothing. You need always resources for doing things, you know. This is the first thing, that renewable energy technology definitely have a much lower energy return on energy invested than the traditional or conventional fossil fuels, so oil and gas and coal. But, and this could be a hope, compared to unconventional oil and gas, and this is the only resource which is still available somehow in huge quantities, compared to the unconventional oil and gas, it will, on the basis of technological improvements, may become more competitive. The second argument is more an argument referring to the aspect I have mentioned yesterday, relating to the, well, the economic system and the ecological challenges, namely that the green revolution, due to this fact that as long as we have this competition, green never can win out. A green revolution, not green growth, would demand that fossil fuels, in terms of proven reserves, have to be left in the ground, even though we know them, even though they are there and they could help us. But so they should not be drilled, neither burned. But the problem is, I come back on this impact on the financial market, and therefore we have here another structural problem which is not easy to overcome. And the third point I want to bring into the discussion is that also renewable technologies have a material burden, a rucksack, a backpack, you can say. Well, they are not depending on fossil fuels, but they are depending on a number of minerals and metals which also have to be cheap and abundant as oil and gas had been. But the problem is they are not cheap and abundant, and they cannot stay cheap and abundant in the future. And these three problems are really serious problems, because they bring us really in the situation that we have to deal with trade-offs. And these are difficult to deal with. I would nevertheless say we have to deal with them somehow, even though they are not so easily in terms of an answer. So neoliberal policy you can say, well, we want to get rid of, but with trade-offs you have to deal, well, quite different. It's quite difficult to deal with them. So here's a graph showing you the different EROI. Those who want to read more about this, in one of my articles, I have mentioned Hall et al. In 2014. I have not given you the title of the book, of the article, where you can read a lot about it. So there's a huge discussion about these EROIs. What you can see here, this is this wonderful time when, you know, of the peak of oil production in the United States. In the 1930s, you know, where, well, oil was just coming out and you had not really serious things to do, just dig a little hole and then oil was there. At this time you had an energy return on energy invested of 1 to 100. So you needed 1 unit of energy in order to get 100 units of energy out of it. Here you see how it decreased, well, there's also fire within all the windmills. Here you see this is domestic in terms, because it's referring to the United States, it's domestic oil production in the year 2000. And you see already it has decreased to 1 to 15. And today it's even lower. So, sure, the energy return on energy invested, let's say in Saudi Arabia or in Iran, where there's only a little bit sand, and below the sand you still have oil, they still have a quite high energy return on investment. But nearly everywhere, I don't know whether, unfortunately I have not my, do I have my peak graphs with me? Yes, I have a peak graph with me. Oh, sure. So most of the other countries who had oil already have crossed the peak or very close to peak, so meaning that they are on the other side of the declining curve of production, have the same problem. The oil fields you can today still discover are very, very tiny, and they are more difficult to access. But actually there are no big oil fields anymore. Onshore, the only thing what you can find is in deep water and, well, the so-called unconventional oil resources. So at least one is here. Yes, one is here of these unconventional oil resources. This is tar sand, which is mainly the basis of oil production in the state of Alberta in Canada, which is an absolutely toxic, destroying form of oil production. And you can see here the energy return on investment is nearly around 1. And you can ask yourself, how can it be? Why are they doing this? Well, the precondition is that energy prices are very high, and everything you do, you know, when you do exploration and when you then start, well, proving a reserve, then start, you know, digging for the stuff, then you have already priced in the expectation of your asset holders, let's say in 10 years, when the oil will be on the market. Therefore, for the oil and for the gas, the so-called paper oil is as important or even more important than the wet oil, because it's already priced in, even though there's nothing there yet. But this is a precondition that the digging will start, or, you know, the exploration will start, because you first have to finance exploration, which is very expensive, and you do it only when the price is very high. So, you know, that's why even this unconventional oil and gas production is going on today, because the expectation is that oil prices, for several reasons, will rise in the future, and then even this very expensive unconventional oil and gas production will become something which pays off at least for those who have invested in it at the right time, and not when again the prices are skyrocketing.
One of the possible reasons for the increase in oil prices could be wars.
Obviously, war is always great.
And Rex Tillerson sitting in Trump's cabinet, right? And
you
who
know,
knows what they're going to do with the.
That's what the broker are doing. You know, when you're on the paper oil market, you are doing what you are teaching, geopolitics. That's what they do as well. So when I want to learn something about the oil price, I always go to these geopolitical, so these think tanks providing geopolitical knowledge, because these are the ones who calculate, you know, which kind of conflicts may drive the price up, and, you know, the production of this fracking gas from the United States is always calculated. Well, we have to bring up the price. So tensions is very good, because it will bring up the price, but only with high oil price, this very expensive form of production of oil and gas in the United States pays off. With a low price, it would not. But unfortunately, and this brings me back to my main topic here, unfortunately also renewable energy has a very low return on investment. It has simply to do with the fact, you know, you can dig for the oil, and then you burn it, and then you have already fuel. It's a little bit too simple, but it's not really more you have to do. So actually, but when it comes to renewable energy technology, you first have to dig for. I come back on this. These very, 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 very difficult to extract minerals. So they are on the crust of the earth, but you have to move mountains in order to get such an amount of these metals. So you first have to dig for the metals, which is very poisoning, which consumes a lot of water. Then you have to transport it to somewhere where it's processed, and then you have to turn it into some sort of equipment. And your handies, your cellular phones, lying there are more than 70 different metals in this little part, in tiny, tiny quantities. And this gives you an idea what it means to install solar panel or even the turbines for the windmills. This is much more complicated in order to produce this, and therefore, if you take all the infrastructure, in terms of transporting the raw material to where it's processed, and then transporting again the final product to where it is then installed, and then transforming again the energy in something else. You have to store the energy, and they have to bring it to the households or to the companies. And this is the reason why we have, in terms of wind energy, at this time, so technological improvement can bring this relationship a little bit up, but we had a EROI of 1 to 18 with the possibility at this time to increase to 1 to 20, where with solar panel it was much less. But their technological improvements have happened and can still happen, so there could be an increase, but we have to understand that never will the energy return on energy invested for solar or wind or other forms of renewable energy. Ethanol, it's only criminal stuff, Ethanol, it's robbing the land from the farmers, and the energy return on investment is absolutely ridiculous. It's definitely less than 1. So this should be simply banned. It should be simply banned. But still, we have to take it into consideration that renewable energy only is a solution in terms of green stuff when it goes ahead with energy, with a reduction of energy consumption to a huge amount. And this is something we really have to keep. We have to reduce energy consumption and shift to 100% renewables. But renewables will not deliver the same amount of energy as the old oil and the old gas has done. The second point I will touch only very, very shortly here now. The second point, why have this now? I make it like this first. Here I have a graph where you can see, well, there is still amount of oil and gas available, but the problem is onshore, easy to extract liquid oil. This is nearly gone, except in the region where we have all the conflicts in Saudi Arabia and Iran. Even for Venezuela, it seems to be that Venezuela is at the peak or already crossed the peak. And what we still have is shallow water liquid oil, onshore heavy oil, oil sands, ultra deep water oil, polar oil shell, and these are all the sources of oil which are more difficult to extract and are more expensive. And because I know that also your energy agency is now, okay, this is a graph which should give you the hint that the peak, so the highest point of production has been reached for most countries. And what is interesting here, those who has discovered oil, the latest, also are running out the earliest. For instance, oil in the North Sea has been discovered quite lately. But the problem is, when you do the exploitation with the most modern technology, you exploit the field much quicker. than what you have done before. And therefore, Norway has invested its revenues from the oil quite intelligently, while the Brits don't have, so they have no oil anymore actually. And this is due to the fact that the more efficient your technology is, the quicker you exploit the resources. And there are still some countries, so here you see the peaks for the different countries. So there are still countries which have not yet peaked. But one thing is for sure, so I'm not accustomed to climb up mountains, but the only thing I know is when you're on the peak, it goes down. And some mountains it goes down very sharply, and other mountains have a soft side on the other side. We don't know. For some resources, as for instance phosphor, we know that it's really more like a shark skin. Yes, this peak, that it goes down very, very quickly because we don't have resources anymore. While for the oil and gas, it may be like this. But one thing is for sure: in the middle of the century, the resources available will be very, very tiny.
So these are conventional oil?
This is conventional oil and gas, yes. So unconventional is there in bigger quantities,
Complex.
but it has a problem. And no, I wanted to show you this. Sorry, it's German, but it's from the World Ocean Report, but I had used the German version. What you can see here, and this might be interesting for the South African case, where just a big oil field has been discovered. So discovery and exploration are two very different things. One thing is simply based on natural science, so the probability that there will be oil is high because of simply academic research, and also the guessing about how big this field might be. Finally, you have to prove your reserve. In order to get money for exploration, you have to prove your shareholders that there really is such a big field. Otherwise, you will not get the money for doing the exploration. And only when you have the reserve as a proven one, then you will get the money for doing the job. It's interesting, for instance, Saudi Arabia, there is no openness in terms of, accountability referring to the reserves Saudi Arabia. What's interesting, Saudi Arabia, year after year, says it has the same amount of reserves. The International Energy is very angry about Saudi Arabia because it cannot be. It's producing oil like hell. How can it be that it always has the same reserves? But it's very, very difficult to prove this when it's a national oil corporation. We have today a huge competition between the privately owned oil corporation and the national ones. The national ones can do everything in order to hide how much resources they have, while the privately run ones, Shell and Exxon and Mobil and so on, they have to prove their shareholders that they have the access to this field. And what is the problem? The second problem is what you can see here. These are the newly discovered fields of offshore oil and gas, and you see the majority of all fields discovered until 2012, because it's done in 2013, this report, is deep water oil and gas. And I will show you a second graph how it turns out in terms of prices. Here you see the price in comparison. So this is onshore, this is flat water, and this is deep water. So and the same situation exists as for South Africa now, for Brazil. They also have only deep water. They have wonderful technology to access this, but the price is very, because you first to heat it up, because oil doesn't go up, when it's 3,000 meters in the ocean. Same with Arctic oil. You need, therefore, the Russians already installed an atomic nuclear plant in the Arctic in preparation for oil discovery, because you know the oil will not come up when it's that deep down because it's very cold there.
This first round of exploration of the South African coast over 190 kilometers cost $140 million.
Yeah, it's absolutely stupid, because you know exploration cost. Then it's never sure whether you know at a time when they could start the production, how the oil price will be at this time, and whether it really will make sense to do the production, not to speak about other impacting constellations. So it's absolutely, you know, could also gamble. You know, actually it's gambling. It's nothing more. So maybe I now come back to the second argument. I make it very short. The second argument is, so even if I would not take all this into consideration, or even if I would solve this problem of the low E-ROI, which I think we can address this problem, understanding that we have to move to 100% renewable, but, well, yes, the energy return on energy investment will be lower, therefore, we have in parallel to reduce our energy consumption to tremendously. The second problem is where will all the money comes from for shifting to the renewable energy technology, taking all the risk into consideration that there's still so much brown energy there. There's exploration going on for more brown fuels, and who will then finance the extension of renewable energy production? This is a question. Bloomberg New Energy Finance, you know, this is an institution run by a former mayor of New York, who advises financial investors, you know, and they're really, they say, well, you should, but actually, this is the amount they have calculated. So this is done so far in terms of this is already done. This is what they expect could be arranged. No. This is what is done in terms of renewable energy investment. This is what they calculate for the year 2014. And here they simply have produced the big question mark, namely there must be a shift of the financial investors, otherwise, you know, you can't do all of this not out of nothing. You know? This is the second big question. This is somehow linked to, I don't know, maybe I mention it now, to the problem that when I really shift to renewable energy, then or have really strict instruments, political instruments available to organize this shift, this would mean that all those who have no assets, brown assets, that these brown assets cannot really be turned into money in order to be reinvested again. So it will cause a carbon bubble bursting, which might be a bubble bursting not comparable to any financial bubble we had before. At least this is what governments are afraid of. So I don't know whether this will finally be the case, but you know, when you take this relationship between growth and CO2 emissions or carbon dioxide into consideration, say yes, actually we have to leave all the stuff in the ground, and there are very interesting activities going on in universities, in trade unions, in churches to de-invest. So also the state funds, so Norway for instance, they had assets, brown assets, so there's no pressure that they should leave the brown assets, so sell the brown assets, and invest in green assets. But the problem is first, who will buy the assets which are sold by trade unions, by churches, by state funds? Somebody is buying these assets. And if nobody will buy these assets anymore, then we have the problem that a lot of financial chaos obviously will happen. And this is one reason why well, at least these guys doing the financing of renewable energy stuff are worried about this financial bubble, this carbon bubble bursting, impacting on a huge financial crisis. But at least it's a possibility. One should not really ignore it. So as long as we live in capitalism, this might be an outcome.
Sorry, Birgit, it relates to a debate in South Africa right now around Eskom and the monopoly it has, the debt it has, over 400 billion owed to the World Bank, a lot of it. And I don't know, I mean, Ruth is the deputy president of the metal workers in South Africa. They have a position on these things. I don't know if you entertain some discussion. Ruth,
Yeah.
what's the perspective on Eskom and its future? And how do you all see it as a trade union?
We are actually recently changing the recent announcement of the
Right. So the government wants to break it up into 3 parts. Sorry, so that Birgit knows. Yeah.
Okay.
And 3 parts meaning what?
Yeah, just tell us.
Transmission, distribution, and integration. There's an attempt by the ANC government to unbundle us Eskom into 3 entities. So we are having reservations as trade unions. We feel very much strong that it's moving towards privatization and political individual process. So these are some of our reservations.
Well, unbundling also happened in Germany, but it does not break in itself the power of these big corporations, as long as, a government is depending on the revenues, and this is a problem, how much is maybe transmission finally can produce much more profit than exploration, but then comes the problem, there will be no transmission if there will not be exploration and production of electricity, And this is a question, how the debate is organized between these elements, and the government still is responsible and should be responsible for it. But if you allowed profits to occur, in the one unit and also in the other unit, then obviously you might have finally a system which works less, as a whole than the system you have today. So you can always blame the other for not submitting the products you expected from it. But I have no idea whether this is a better way for South Africa than you has it today. Sometimes, indeed, competition is not that bad for some sort of monopoly, which enforces a lot of power. But I have no idea whether this is a solution for situation in South Africa, because it does not really give an incentive to move away from the fossil industry, from the fossil fuels. It's simply a way of handling better your energy production and
from what I understand, the union's not opposed to renewable energy. I mean, they have had the best positions historically on socially owned renewable energy, the need for a transition. And I think that's still part of your position. You'll still keep that perspective in.
I don't know. Do you have a feed-in tariff system in South Africa?
No. I think there are 1 or 2 municipalities piloting it and so on.
Because this is astonishing, when you compare it, even a country like Colombia, or so, which have a lot of coal, obviously. So they have it in the meantime, and it's working quite well. So it's not working, from one day to the other, but you can see you really make renewable energy competitive, even on a capitalist market in a short period of time. If you, in parallel, diminish the power of the big energy players, So if you, let's say, work as they always worked, and then have in parallel the individual households and small communities or bigger communities. Today we have a lot of communities, whole cities in Germany, as well, much more in Austria, which are 100% independent because they can produce their own energy
So the position on socially owned renewable energy is consistent with that, but the question is, how do you finance that as well? And how do you secure jobs for workers? I think those are the two issues.
Yes, actually, in Germany, it was financed by the individual households, I wanted to say. So it was not financed by the corporations. So, we pay, since now more than 20 years, we pay much more for the energy than it would be necessary. And this money is passed over to those providing renewable energy, feeding it in the system, the energy they don't need, because usually there is oversupply in particular times. And so it's actually a financing done by the consumers, while the big corporation, the big car industry, the chemical industry, nobody from the industry is financing actually the bringing up of renewable energy technology as a competitive one compared to the brown one. So industry are exempted, but still it works. But obviously it works because we have a lot of earning households. You cannot compare it with South Africa, where you have a few rich and then a middle class, but very many people who cannot afford to pay a higher energy price. So this is a situation you cannot transfer one to one. But I know, for instance, from Colombia, which is also very, very, very poor, that they finally succeeded to have this system installed, which seems to work quite nicely. But that was since a long time your hand up. Sorry.
So just a question. When you say that an aggregate will need to reduce consumption, does that factor in the fact that if population growth rates have turned?
Yeah, I can say it for if you really calculate, it would be a long discussion. We have some calculation in Germany done by our environmental ministry for the individual consumption, and it's expressed in CO2 emissions. You need always one denominator. You can also express it in energy quantity, but it doesn't really matter. So in order to get an idea, what the challenge is. Unfortunately, I didn't have brought this slide with me. I had done this calculation on the basis of the environmental ministry's calculation. So they identify how much does an individual household in Germany consume for transport, for housing, for heating, for education, for food, and for wastewater, stuff like this, and they come up with a very impressive number. The number is that we German, on average, so on average mean the richer household, they definitely consume 3 times as much, while there are poor households who consume half of it. So the average for a German household has been 11.7 ton per person and year, and now it's 11.6 ton per person and year. And in order to make things somehow just, ecological, just, at least, so it would be the best to reduce it to 1 ton. But this is something which is taken as a fantasy. But what would be really the idea, in terms of change necessary for Germany, would be to reduce the consumption of 11.6 ton per year and person to 2 ton per year and person. And then you have this as an indicator, and now we can discuss which policy instruments will help you, even though I wanted to discuss this in the very end, but we can also do it here. Which policy instruments will help you to at least approach this goal? And my argumentation usually is, the first thing humans have to do is to eat and to have access to water. The rest is not unimportant, but this is a precondition. Therefore, for us, for Germany, I can make a very nice program, starting with our food consumption and our agriculture, in order to reduce the amount of CO2 we are producing there, to free some emissions for all the other purposes. And then I come up with some recommendations what should be done, and I come back on this maybe in the very end. But this has to be done, I think, for each society individually, because constellations are very different here. Sure, you would also say food production and water delivery is more important than electricity, but I prepared something, I cannot do it. Yesterday I read something about the case in Zimbabwe recently, and you see, I come back on this, that the energy and the food and the water nexus is so close to each other that it will be very, very difficult to say, well, in order to save water here, we have to decrease energy there, because energy prices are impacting on the production of food, and this obviously impact on political stability, stuff like this. So, nevertheless, I think each society has to find, the point where change has to be started first. And as far as I do know, yes, you already know, if you have a society which is so unequal, some consuming so much land and water and energy, and others have no access to energy and water and land, then obviously this is the most important point to start with. While in a country like Germany, you can start also with other issues. So we can start also very, very easily, without so much suffering, with our transport system. It's so easy, I would say, to change our transport system, not in a zero-emission one, but at least to reduce emission to such a huge amount in Germany, which is very easy, because compared to South Africa or other places, we are a tiny country. And in our country, cities existed before the car was invented, meaning that the city were already connected, and there are connections existing, and it's very densely populated. While when you have a country like South Africa, where you have to bridge huge distances, and where you have a less dense population, obviously the challenges are different. I wouldn't say it's impossible to install a decent public transport system also in South Africa, but this is a challenge which is so different, and I'm not an expert in this type of science. While for Europe, where you have these densely populated areas, I think it would be quite easy. Well, it's not easy, but in terms of technically easy, to come up with proposals which would reduce the enormous amount of fuel consumed for the stupid form of mobility very, very easily. And also our agriculture could be reduced in terms of energy consumption. Not easily, but more easily than, let's say, here in South Africa. So I think one can also only point to, what are the most important issues one has to take into consideration, has also to take into consideration these trade-offs, where you have always to decide finally, when you have a trade-off, you cannot say this is right and this is wrong, but I have to decide politically which way forward. And well, I come back later on this proposal from my husband who died, Alfred Yoda. Let's go for the small proposals, because if the small proposals turn out to be wrong ones, you can easily shift and go the other way. While when you have these big proposals, where you change the whole structure, then it's very, very easily to become path dependent, and that's what we are. We are so path dependent, for instance, on the individual transport, that you cannot even imagine a different kind of transport system, or a different kind of, let's say, different kind of mobility, which must not be a transport system, but a source of mobility. So smaller proposals, smaller projects may fit better, because when you finally find out, well, this was not the right one, then we can shift more easily in a way, and therefore I would say, well, this is a discussion which has to be started on the floor everywhere. Should I go on to the next part? Which the third, was there more questions?
I don't know if they want to have a break or...
Okay, a break, sorry.
So how long? 10 minutes?
Depends on you.
10 minutes, just walking,
Dimension or category of trade-offs. And this trade-off has to do with the fact that when we move towards renewable energy technologies, but not only, those are relevant here because they are competing on the same raw materials as what I will talk about tomorrow in the public speech, the new technologies which are necessary for Industry 4.0 or digitalization or artificial intelligence. They compete for the same materials as modern warfighting is demanding. And this somehow is expressed in this graph here, done by a Swedish Institute on Environmental Resource, the theory. What you can see here is a projection. They assume that, yes, there will be still increasing demand of fossil fuel, even though at a moderate amount, but still increasing. What you see increasing relative to the 80s and 90s is quite a lot, namely metals, and in particular the green one are the minerals, and the light green is biomass. And what you see here is really a problem which is very, very difficult to solve, and hopefully you'll find a discussion, because, as I said, with trade-offs, we cannot ignore them. We simply have to decide what for us is more important than other things. You know, there cannot be a solution say, well, we want to have everything. So it has to do with the fact that also renewable energy technologies have a material base, or there are use values. So the notion critical minerals and metals has been first printed, I guess, by the European Union. In the meantime, also US government agencies using the term in order to identify what is critical from their point of view. So critical, on the one hand, describes a kind of shortage, a kind of scarcity of the mineral or metal as such, but it's always a geopolitical dimension in it. Therefore, you will sometimes find that, you know, what is termed critical from the US point of view is something else than from the European point of view. While I do mention European Union and the United States as well, they are nearly 100% import dependent when it comes to these metals and minerals, on which not only renewable energy technology, but all the modern technologies, information and communication technology, as well as all these technologies on which we would need in order to have Industry 4.0 to be installed. On the case of China, I came a little bit later, even though I have put it here on the slide. First, I want to clarify green capitalism, green growth, New Green Deal depends on minerals and metals, which, in particular minerals, which are scarce. The term scarcity I will elaborate in a second. Well, they can and will replace some of the fossil fuels as strategic commodities. Doesn't mean that fossil fuels will disappear in terms of its strategic relevance, but to a huge amount, these minerals and metals will have the same strategic role in the future as oil and gas have already has today and had in the past. And this is indeed resulting in more aggressive competition between producer and consumer countries. And the particular case of China is that China is in the same time a producer and a consumer country. And this makes China so strong in this respect. I come back on this. And I gave here only some examples. I could go on, but I will mention tomorrow in the public lecture on digitalization more. Some of these metals and minerals you never heard about. The list is very long. Nobody really knows about this. You know about nickel and steel and gold and silver, stuff like this. But these are the minerals of the future, because everything depends on this. And maybe lithium is the only one you might have heard about, because lithium is a basic technology for the batteries needed for electric cars. Therefore, everybody speaks about lithium.
Just to say to you, we have 70% of the world's platinum.
Yeah.
The Marikana massacre mine.
This is interesting, but the problem is, that's therefore always when I show you the graph where some countries are placed, not all the countries with all the resources, but the problem is for such an item there, you need 70 different minerals and metals. It doesn't really help that you have 90% of the production or one, but the problem is you cannot produce a final product out of it, because this would be, the point where you really can step forward. You need for renewable energy production a lot of this stuff. It doesn't mean, when I put here platinum necessary for catalysts, that you can do it only with this. I simply gave you an example what, for example, is needed as one basic source, and sometimes there's substitution possible, but very often it's not the case. This has been done by the European Commission very early, so as I said, this is already now repeated by the US. What they have done here is to put the most important metals and minerals. The blue and red one are the metals, and the red one are the minerals. They put it in a group from the perspective of the European Union. Does not mean that, from the perspective of the US or from the perspective of China or from the perspective of South Africa, it would be the same. But from the perspective of the European Union, these resources have a moderate risk of becoming very scarce in the next future, in the nearest future. This was a less high risk, and this was a high risk. It's a very high risk, because 100% dependence and demand increasing threefold, fourfold in the next years. That's the basic message from this produced from the European Union. So what we should understand, even though it's a long debate, I like to speak about these resource governance issues, but it's not here the time to do so. But we should understand that scarcity, the problem is in German, there is a difference between scarcity in economic sense. If something is scarce in economic sense, it has to do with high prices or low prices, or that there is market access blocked somehow, So this is the notion of scarcity in economic sense. While, unfortunately, when I try to translate it into English, I have to stay with the word scarcity, even though in German there are two different words. Because for this, which I here define as physical scarcity, in German we have Knappheit, which is the economic term of scarcity, and Mangel. Mangel means really there's something simply no longer available or not available, which is something else than being scarce in economic term, because the scarcity always reflects to, if the price will be high enough, there will be also somebody who can afford to buy this stuff, While physical scarcity has something to do with the accessibility of something. So, and there are minerals and metals. There's one guy called Diederin, which is a Dutch geologist, who has dealt with this quite extensively, but there are also some geologists in Germany who have dealt with this issue of peak metal. Has to do with the fact that some metals are so that only if they are there in high concentration, they are easy to access, while if they are in other combinations, so other combinations in the stone, you know, very deep and in special combination, it's no longer economic feasible to extract these minerals. So there is a break-even point where it doesn't make sense anymore to, let's say, to move a whole mountain in order to get access to this mineral. This is economically no longer a really good thing. And this obviously seems to be the case with some of these minerals, that the break-even point, you know, where you say, well, there could be some sort of economic use made of this, is simply no longer very plausible. So accessibility, but also the depletion simply of a reserve. And with phosphate, it seems to be that except of two big fields still exist in Morocco and, as far as I know, in Kazakhstan, there are no big fields anymore existing. So that they can say there's really depletion of a reserve. But today we have also to consider geopolitical scarcity. And geopolitical scarcity means having access to the resource. Access to the resource, no matter what it costs, or maybe it matters what it costs, but some will not have access because they will not be able to pay the high price. But the problem is that if there is a country, and we have this country, which is China, which has as well the resources as the cheap labor to extract the resources under very damaging conditions, both damaging for health of the workers as well for the environment because it's very toxic, and then move the stuff towards processed and produce final products out of it. Solar panels, as well wind turbines, and in the future electric cars. Then you have really a challenge which is not comparable to any other challenge, but because we had the split, or we still have the split, between those who are rich, as I gave it yesterday in the word of Adam Smith, wealthy, you know, because they have accumulated so much monetary wealth, capital, and the natural riches. So those countries who have a lot of natural resources. We had the split already, but you know, when it comes to these critical minerals, we have a country now, a big country now, who has a lot of these very relevant strategic minerals, has the will and the capability to build final products out of it, and nobody is able to stop this country. There have been export control already established by China, and China has been sued for the WTO by the European Union and the US, but actually, you know, nobody really can do anything against. You know, when you finally have in the German market solar panels, which cost half of what German solar panels cost. Obviously, everybody is buying the Chinese one. It's not only that the Africans are buying the Chinese ones. Also in Germany, they are buying now the Chinese ones. And the next step is the Chinese companies are buying the German companies producing solar panels, which had produced solar panels, and wind power is now the next step. So yes, it has an impact, and therefore we have a lot of conflicts going on, and I guess, you know, part of the new also violent conflicts to come in the next future will also move around these methods. Secondly, also this is a geopolitical issue, obviously. I don't have to tell you that so many social and ecological conflicts are grouped around mining, and mining these rare earth metals is, as I said, very toxic and very water consuming, impacting a lot on villages, on indigenous people living around. And yes, for a country like China, it's very easy to ignore, at least until now, it's easy to ignore the needs of, the villages living around and living under very, very horrible conditions. But it's not only that we have to blame China. One of the minerals which is very, very important, obviously, is cobalt, and we know where it's mined, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. So it's always, this is always a dirty business. No, it doesn't matter really where it takes place, but in the dependence on these minerals in the future makes it even more likely that conflicts evolving around these mining activities also will become quite serious. Here I gave you some, this is from these geologists. So it's a different kind of view, arguing that these minerals, metals, are close to peak. Well, there is huge discussion. So some would simply deny that silver and nickel are close to peak. So I have no competence really to say whether this is correct or not. I simply want to give you this as a source, and you can look it up because the sources are given in my articles. At least for copper, we have a very clear understanding that even though it might not peak, but due to the fact that in the next future we will need so much copper for this Industry 4.0 and all the stuff, that the demand referring to copper is increasing so much that I can imagine that the peak of copper production really is very close, even though you would assume that copper is not really in shortage somewhere. But these are some of the so-called rare earth metals. Rare earth means they are not really rare, they are nearly everywhere, even in Germany. But the problem is they are just under our feet. So you will have to really to dig a hole and evacuate whole Berlin, where I'm living, in order to get access to a tiny amount of rare earth. Absolutely nobody would be so stupid, to do this. So, so the problem with the rare earth metal is that they are only in tiny quantities, and it's very, very. You really have to dig big holes in order to get access. And here you have one of these graphs. So I guess from a U.S. perspective, you will get other minerals and metals and the declaration as critical. This is done by the European Commission. So from the European view, so what we need in order to produce our final products, yes? These countries are those countries from where we import the most relevant stuff. And the only thing I want to show you is this graph. And here, a lot of these rare earth metals you never heard about before because they are normally not in the center of attention. They are produced, but in the next graph you can see China is even increasing its production. So, for instance, germanium there. This is the third. We see in 2003 there was only a small amount of germanium produced in China, while in 2012 you have 70% of world production done in China. And when you look up some of the other numbers, you will find the same development. So China is even increasing its production of these minerals because it wants to become a forerunner, not only in renewable energy technology, but also in artificial intelligence, in robotics. I will speak about this tomorrow. And for all this, you need these particular minerals.
Sorry, Birgit, on your previous slide, there was, I know it's a European Union perspective, but doesn't Australia also have a lot of rare earth?
Yes, Australia. But
But
that's therefore I said, you know, the picture are less reliable because, you know, you would need more of these analysis done by, well, usually it's done by the highly industrialized countries. So I don't know, I guess also the French will have, the United States have. I don't know whether maybe Britain also have something like this, I'm not sure. But you know, usually you don't have this type of analysis because it's always a perspective, you know, we are dependent on imports and how much of our imports are coming from this country and this country. And obviously, the perspective, if I would place China here, so I have no data on China, but if I would place China here, Australia would be much more important for raw material exports, not only for coal to China, but also for some other minerals and metals. So it's really a geopolitical issue. It's not that you can get, I looked around a lot, but it's definitely very difficult to get an overview, you know, in terms of, you know, how much of the, well, let's say, world resources are there, because the data on this stuff, on metals, are even more difficult to get than data on oil and gas reserves. Can I first take this gentleman?
So if all these companies get asteroid mining right, asteroid mining, if they get that right, it's a different policy question.
I will mention one of the students in the very end, you know, that we are now leaving even planet Earth, going to the stratosphere and hoping that we can mine there the stuff which is scarce here. Yes, this is one of the engineers' answer to our problem.
So I'm not saying this is the engineer's answer.
No.
But where would this policy question lie? Who would have to answer this question?
Where would the policy question lie?
How do you manage asteroid mining and other applications?
First of all, I doubt that it is possible. Secondly, I'm happy that I will no longer be alive, and they are able, if they would be able to do this. It's really no longer. Yesterday we have mentioned, you know, the way we are now destroying the planet in a planetary scale, and you know what this means really our atmosphere, but you know, going beyond the atmosphere and the stratosphere, and the idea that we can mine, you know, in the deep sea, and we go to the asteroids in order to collect there some stuff. Yes, it's done. But you know, from my perspective, I don't want really to spend a second about this, because I think we have so much problems to be solved first. And you know, this is a fantasy. You know, since we have so much problems dealing, you know, with our social and economic surrounding, we always place the hope on the engineers. And there's also a recommendation. You know, I don't know. I have written down the name here. You know him. Well, a quite famous U.S. economist teaching in Columbia and advising World Bank stuff.
Stiglitz Krugman?
No, that was not Stiglitz, but I will look it up. He really has written an article saying, now it's time to pass over to the engineers. You know, politicians can no longer solve our problems, you know, so pass over to the engineers, and it's, well, I will mention later some more of these technologies, not only asteroid mining for getting access to the resources, but for our bigger problem to get rid of our CO2 emissions, we need other as super technologies, which definitely are so risky if they would ever be realized. But actually, I don't want to care about this, because for me it's fantasy still. And hopefully, before this comes to a stage where I can say that there is a technology existing, I hope that we have organized a different kind of world.
So on that issue, we should ask the Eroi question too. Really,
Sure,
is it
yeah.
worth it?
You know, you ask the Euro questions, the water question, you know, a lot of other questions, you will come always to the situation. It's simply not possible, and it's also not really that something we should wish for.
Looking at that map, does it mean that the Africa has declined in terms of significance of mineral resources?
No. This is simply for referring to these strategic metals necessary for renewable energy production, for computer technology, for modern warfighting systems. So for everything which needs these wonderful electronic equipment. So doesn't mean that we don't need steel anymore. Doesn't mean that we don't need other traditional metals anymore. This is simply referring to these so-called critical raw materials, and they are critical because they don't exist in the European Union. So we are nearly 100% dependent on imports. So this is the reason why other metals which we import, for instance, from Africa, are not here on the list, because they are not claimed critical. They are still there in abundance. It's only a question of getting access to them. While these are critical because they are concentrated there, there is a tiny amount existing. I come back on this, and there is nearly no recycling rate.
Just as a teaser, I want to throw this in, and that's got to do with Japan, right? So it's an industrial economy, but it doesn't have resources. It'll be interesting to see how it looks at the world.
Japan has nothing, and therefore it's so heavily imprisoned in this nuclear energy technology. I'm glad that I'm not part of the Japanese civil society organizations and movements, because it's really very difficult for a country like Japan to discuss alternatives. They can discuss alternatives in relation to agricultural production, but they are so densely populated. When you compare it to Africa, you have a huge territory, yes, and you have a growing population, but compared to what you have in Japan, I really would be afraid to think about futures in Japan, because it's much more challenging. I think so. They have nothing, and they are in a very precarious situation in terms of earthquake and thunderstorms and stuff like this. So it can be worse. And I guess Japan is in such a situation. Yes, this is the last point to the raw materials so far, even though I will come back on these tomorrow. This is the last problem attached to these raw materials needed for renewable energy and all the other modern technologies. What you see here, this is everything we have. We have nothing more in terms of the metals. You see there's iron and copper and nickel and tin. The blue ones, they have a recycling rate of more than 50%. So one argument in terms of social ecological transformation would mean recycling, reusing again. You can do it with these traditional metals, and these are the metals which come very often from Africa, yes? You can do it with these. But what you see here in red, these are the metals and minerals, mostly minerals, we need for all the modern technologies. And what you see here in red has a recycling rate around 1%. So even if you, in terms of technological progress in the next future, will double and triple and quadruple, I don't know, it's very difficult to do this, so simply quadruple the recycling rate, you still end up with something below 5%. And this really makes the thing so, and also the orange and the yellow one have very low recycling rates, the orange goes up to 10%, but what you see here in red, these are the critical minerals, and they have a very low recycling rate, and this Therefore, I say we have there something like a trade-off, and we simply have to decide. I will come back again and again on this argument. We have to decide for which use, for which purpose we use these minerals. We cannot use them for all the technologies we have recently available on the table. We are able to develop them and to produce them, and the question will be, should we really go ahead with this technology or with this? Should we have, well, I come back on this tomorrow, these wonderful digital equipments, or should we use these minerals for bringing up renewable energy technology? And definitely not electric cars. Electric cars are consuming so much of lithium and of other metals that you simply can forget about, the shift in renewable energy technology if you really even substitute half of the cars recently on the planet with electric cars. So this is definitely not the right way. Now I add two more points to the question of, to the argument. Well, I have it here. Now I want to add two more points to the argument why a green capitalism, Green New Deal is not really the solution. It has to do with the problem that we don't only need energy to live, but we also need food. Well, I would say first we need food and water, even though there is a very close connection. I come back on this. So productive and cheap labor, everybody knows, depend on the available of cheap food, even though cheap is relative. I'm not sure how much an average South African, so I take average now, even knowing that the poor Africans can spend much less on food than the rich ones, but I have to use the average, otherwise I cannot compare it with Germany. Can you give me, or have you any idea, what is it, the average South Africans, so including the poorest and the richest? How much percentage of their household income are they spending on food?
So poor households spend over 50%. But we have an index called the PAXA index, which looks at the basic basket of goods. And it costs about 2,400 rands to have a nutritional basket of food for a poor household. Our social grants are about 1.5, 1.6, and they're not keeping up with even the cost of an essential basket of goods.
So, but nevertheless, let's stay with the percentage point, even though it's stupid to do so, but otherwise we cannot do the comparison. You have that word?
2,400.
No.
You said 50%, but that's just for poor households.
For poor households.
The wealthy. She's asking
So,
the
the poor household 50%, let's assume, if I put the few rich people in, then it's something like 40%. Okay? Less?
Yeah, because the percentage.
Probably less.
No,
Less.
I think if the middle class is considered to be, be less, it would probably be.
Less.
Would be
36.
Yeah, probably closer to 30. It's highly skewed, so 70%.
Highly skewed.
So you would have a percentage that's above 300,000 and then another percentage above 600,000. That would be significantly less for, but it would be like above 600,000 a year would be much more like 10%, so it's skewed. It's really extreme inequality. So
Probably because I cannot compare it if I don't have the percentage point, you know?
Okay, say 30%.
Have you guessed what an average German household, meaning a couple with 2 children, that's how it's calculated, I cannot do anything against, and it's calculated in comparison to other European countries, so I have these numbers, and I know that you spend more. Even the rich people, I guess, spend more in South Africa, not only the poor, than an average German. Have you any guess what an average German is spending on food? It's a lottery. Please give me a number.
3-4%.
Huh?
3-4%.
3-4. No, come on. It's not that they simply give us. Even though though we are importing so much, but you know, the fuel has to be paid at least. You know, even if you don't pay the workers, even if you don't pay the farmers, at least the fuel is expensive and has to be paid. No, the average German household has to spend 11% of its income on food. And you know, when you go to North Africa, you have a number such as 45% in Egypt, and it might be that you have less in South Africa, but in other places in the world, you know, the poorer the population, the higher the amount of food spent. So the point is, you can't have cheap labor only when you have cheap food. So it's already a contradiction somehow, and the question is, how can this go on? The point is when the food becomes even less cheap, let's say less cheap than today. Even though you would not say, you know, for a poor South African household that the food is cheap here, but I really want to say the perspective is that it becomes less cheap. For Germany, it must become less cheap. You know, we need, so therefore I mentioned before, when we speak about transformation, you know, we really have to look at the countries, you know, and at the different countries. And my proposal for Germany must be different ones. I will have to start with the food issue, and will have to say, farmers have to get a decent price. That's the first thing. And to subsidize poor households is something which has to come out of other parts of the government budget, but not, you know, by depressing the prices for farmers. And it's also the case for farmers in Germany, for milk farmers, for dairy farmers, that they really cannot live a living on the basis what they get for the milk. You know, and this is they really would need the double price what they get from milk. Therefore, please keep it like this. If the food is increasing in terms of prices, if the food prices increase, there will be impact on a lot of other issues, and it seems to be that we have to face a constellation that this will be the case. I think I don't have to go here into detail referring to the Green Revolution and all the damages caused by the Green Revolution, in particular on the ecological front. I guess you are much better educated in these issues than I am. But this is something we have to add to this green stuff, because yesterday I have no access to television, but at least to my cellular phone. So, what I learned about the situation recently in neighboring country Zimbabwe, 100% increase in energy price goes together with poor rain, erratic water pattern, farmers in need of irrigation, but due to high food prices, fuel prices, lack of fuel for the generators, therefore large-scale losses in crops. So impact as food price increase quite heavily, since it comes together with other problems such as dwindling foreign reserves. So what we have is a huge disaster. You have migration, no idea how South African policy will deal with this, but in a way it's a showcase. It's a showcase for a lot of similar developments across the world. Therefore, one can say energy, water, and food are very, very closely linked. And this we cannot disconnect from the question of a green capitalism or perspective of whether within capitalism we can solve the problem. So I guess I don't have to show you this. It's clear what climate change, what we have a little bit touched yesterday, will bring about. So this is from the World Resources Institute, the probability of change to the worse. This is what is red here, or change to the better in terms of more rain. You can see, very unfair, we will be privileged again. so we will have more water, even though not water at the right time of the year. So there will be negative impact as well. It's not only fun to have water in huge quantities, but at least a rich country can handle it somehow, if prepared, while poor countries cannot handle having water at the wrong time of the year in huge quantities, while in the other time of the year having these increasing temperature with huge impact on food. So the food and water insecurity, the food energy and the water, energy and food security nexus has to be taken into account, because we can discuss this at length, but we see that this system is so heavily connected to each other that yes, we can imagine that much more energy is produced on a renewable base, but obviously dams are not part of the story, because dams take water away from where it's needed and impact on the environment. So not all renewable energy production is supportive for food production and therefore for the livelihood of people. So again, we have a kind of contradiction, or a kind of very difficult it's difficult to start, let's say, here or there or there. The problem is it has to be started somehow in parallel. And what is impacting really, so I didn't deal with this now, but I learned that there are so many recommendations, in particular going to African countries, to use now these wonderful drones in order to identify how intelligently you can irrigate your fields, taking the latest news from a little cloud which may come, and then you organize things on your field differently. That's what is really proposed by international organization to a huge amount. I don't think that
it's happening here too, by the way.
Huh?
It's happening here too in the agriculture.
Yes, because you can sell the stuff then. Plus, what is also negatively impacting, I have given you the EROIs of oil and gas and the other renewable energy technologies, but you have also seen that fuel produced out of agrarian products has the lowest EROI, so energy return on investment. So this might become a little bit better when you have a second generation of biofuels existing, where you really use waste to a huge amount. But I assume, in rich countries you have a huge amount of waste, and it can be an additional source of creating renewable energy. But in poor countries, you usually don't have that much natural waste existing, that you can say, well, this will solve our problem of having a very low energy return on investment, plus not stealing the land for agricultural purposes. So even if it's always claimed, in Africa there's so much land which is not cultivated, let's use it for fuel production. But the point is you can use it in an intelligent way. I guess still for agricultural production. You must not use it for energy production, but this is what is expected. This is from a source from the Heinrich Böll Foundation, the foundation of the Green Party in Germany, and that's what they expect in terms of, we are now here. Look here, that's what they expect. So you can imagine what this would mean in terms of trade-off between food production and fuel production. If you really are producing this amount of fuel out of territory which may be recently not used for food production, but could be if you do it in an intelligent way. So this is a trade-off which also has to be taken into account. In addition, obviously, I don't know whether, I guess you are familiar with these sort of graphs, are you? But still, for me, it's interesting where the investor investors are coming from who are buying all the land in Africa. They are coming mostly from where the financial centers are, and a lot of them are coming from Europe, as you can see.
So the purple squares are the
What?
the purple squares are the investors. The purple squares are the investors.
The purples are squares are the investors, and the red bullets are the amount of territory they are buying. And you can easily see that well, a lot of recently not used land or underused land, that's how they claim it, is placed in Africa. That's what they're buying. So you have an impact here. Also, you know, from what we have discussed yesterday from the financial market, buying land is a sort of storing wealth. You know, and no matter what you finally will do, actually you will turn small-scale farmers into workers, very poorly paid workers maybe, if you use it for agricultural production. But I guess most of this land will be used for fuel production and not for food production.
Can I ask a question about that? I read it was a couple of years ago about how the same kind of slide, but the land that was being bought was also where there were aquifers, underground aquifers for the water. And I don't. Do you know the map of that? Because I remember it was around, I think it was Brazil, Uruguay, and there's one of the largest.
Well, there's quite a lot of territory which is bought in Brazil. But I guess we have to assume that the motives to buy land in Latin America, but mostly in Africa, well, it's also in Australia and
I'm just asking because it's for production and they have underground
well,
aquifers.
I guess it's for different purposes.
Yeah.
I guess, for instance, where there is really fertile land taken away in Ethiopia, for instance, I guess they use it really for producing food. So the Chinese really let former small-scale farmers now as workers produce food for their markets in China. But this is not the only use. You know, you also buy the land in order to produce agrofuels. You buy the land in order to, well, simply to keep your wealth. You know what I said yesterday about this art market. You buy art not because you like the painting, but in order to store your wealth because you're afraid of, well, even the dollar might devaluate, and then, you know, what kind of currency should you, in which kind of currency should you store your wealth? And, you know, all these corporations, they can go bankrupt, you know, they can fail. So this is a way of storing wealth as well. It's not
as far as
only
you know,
using.
they haven't actually done the prospecting because this was about how they were choosing land where they knew there was very large underground aquifers, so that it made their wealth even more.
But actually, you are absolutely right. Therefore, there's a water, energy, and food nexus is so heavily intertwined that you really cannot disconnect it. It's true, you know, you can read a lot of geopolitical stuff saying water is a next oil. You know, water is the oil of the future. So you buy territory where you have access to water, be it that you are in the upper stream of a river or what else. You know, so these are very important motives, obviously. But I'm not. So I don't know a research which really classifies the different motives of the world, because it's even very difficult to get this. You know, normally they don't report why they are buying land where. You know, so it's very difficult to find out. You know, the quantities, and the motives are even more in the shadow. I would say so. Before I come to my conclusion, let's turn to a last argument which brings us back to what we have discussed yesterday. I would say, in addition to the shortfalls or trade-offs related to renewable energy production, which makes this project of green capitalism very unreliable, and in addition to these these complicated nexus between food, water, and energy, we have also to take into account this, I coined it here, the double-edged sword of labor productivity, which brings me a little bit to the lecture tomorrow, or the public talk tomorrow, because artificial intelligence and digitalization and Industry 4.0 is about increasing labor productivity. Now, as I mentioned yesterday, increasing labor productivity is the only source capital has in order to accumulate, you know. So, but the problem is, we have a constellation where capital intensity, so capital which is fixed, which is bound in machinery, in intellectual property rights, and in energy. You know, you can't do no kind of industry without energy, which is without access to property rights, and without machinery. And you finally, you know, have fixed capital which you cannot move. It's there, and you have to make something out of it. And the only way to make more money out of it, more capital, is, well, increasing labor productivity. And it seems to be that recently we have a constellation where labor productivity is no longer increasing in such an amount as it has been in the past. So it's a very controversial issue, therefore I will not really elaborate on it because I'm not an expert in this. I only know there's a huge discussion. Some say, well, there will be a huge push in labor productivity based on digitalization and so on, and others are doubting this. And since I already have mentioned this economist yesterday, namely this Gordon, you know, this is a guy who has used the data from Madison and has projected this long-term development of economic growth for 2,000 years and tried to prolong it to the next 100 years. And what he has done, because, you know, nobody really, well, people are discussing his results, but he has done it properly. At least this, nobody really doubts. So what he has done is following, for the United States, so it doesn't mean that labor productivity for other countries must develop in the same amount or less amount. But at least for the United States, he has done this. So this is year 48, and this is the year 1972. This was a trend. This is the green line, the trend in terms of labor productivity increase in the United States. And what he has then done, well, I now calculate, assuming that the trend would have been stable until year 2008. Then it must have been the red line, the red curve there, you know? So, not the red, the green one. You know, this is a trend, 1948 to 1972, and if you prolong it to 2008, it would have been this curve. But what the actual trend was, the factual trend was, is there in the red. In the blue is a trend between 72 and 96, and the red is then the trend between 96 and 2004. No, 2012. And he calculates that there is obviously a gap. So if the labor productivity would have been advanced in the same amount as it has been in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, then it would have been there, but it is there. And from this he calculates, well, in his paper he also gives some explanation for this, which is now not relevant for us, but at least we should figure out that it could be the case that labor productivity is no longer increasing to such an amount, which is somehow plausible, you know, because you cannot really imagine that when you put so much dead labor, you can say, in the machinery, plus using so much energy as has to be used for this new production, that you can increase labor productivity beyond all needs, or even in the same amount as before. And this, again, gives us a hint that capitalism as we know it, which is based on increasing labor productivity, well, cannot go on in the same manner as it has been in the past. At least I want to add this argument before coming to my conclusions. This is not a central argument, but it's something we should take into account when we speak about the economy. So I have now several conclusions. The first conclusion would be that the green economy will not save capitalism from its own contradiction. The green economy is still about valorization of nature. There is nothing which is really changed in relation to this. And learning from Marx, the free gifts of nature are only helpful for increasing the wealth of private owners if mineral, energy, agricultural resources are not part of the capital advance, so not part of labor. Only if you can get it for free, for nothing, then it really is part of your accumulated wealth. When you really have to pay for it in terms of labor power, or when energy becomes very expensive, then obviously the accumulation as we know it, I wouldn't say it comes to a halt, but it does not process in the same way as before. So yes, we have still a constellation where what Marx coined the primitive accumulation, simply robbing the natural resources first and then, plundering it, and finally they are destroyed. So we have the scarcity existing. Well, it's still going on, and what you have mentioned, the fantasies that we can go to the asteroids and do our resource extractions there. It's the idea it can go on forever, but I simply refuse to engage seriously in science fiction stuff. What is here is already seriously enough, because when you look at this land grabbing aspect we have discussed as a latest point, yes, it's still ongoing, this more primitive accumulation, but I would doubt that this infinite accumulation of capital is possible, because always new frontiers have to be found, both on the input side as well as on the output side. We have discussed that there are absolute limits. So this is the one conclusion. The second conclusion would take me a little bit longer. The second conclusion is concerning our idea about technological innovation. I think we are really crazy. We are really crazy because, when we don't have any idea anymore how to solve social problems, how to deal with conflict in a society, always somebody comes up with a technical solution. So technical progress, and there was this solution. So instead of engaging in conflicts and instead of finding solution among human beings, we always hope that there will be a new discovery which will solve our problems via technical equipment. So first argument, while this, from my perspective, doesn't work and will not work and will not save capitalism from its inherent contradictions. First, because quantum leap changes in technological progress are needed. So technological progress, which this guy, Tim Jackson, which I have mentioned, have calculated, would have to be 10 to 20 times quicker than the technological progress we had in the last decades. And we had already a very quick technological progress, right? So the idea that in order to find technological solution for a lot of our problems is already stupid and the time frame. Secondly, what I have mentioned as a rebound effect. So we have technological innovations which helps us to make more, well, to use water more efficiently and lose less water. Yes, we have this technology, but it doesn't mean that we're consuming less water. We are wasting water, or we are consuming as well this in addition to the water. So this is this rebound effect. So efficiency gains are possible. They will still happen in the future, but they will not prevent us from consuming and from producing, distributing and consuming more. Secondly, the greener technology, I've given you the point that they have a lower energy return on energy invested. They have the obstacles that recycling is much more difficult with these very complex technologies. Therefore, I would doubt, this would be the second argument why I doubt that technological progress will save us. I have also mentioned the trade-offs with regard to metals, which will substitute to a certain amount fossil fuels, but the trade-off that we can use also the metals only one time, either for renewable energy technology, which I would like, or for an electric car, or for autonomous weapon systems, or for robots, but not for all of it. This would be the other argument. Fourth argument would be green technologies can only become competitive in relation to the brown technologies when we organize a quick phase-out. Quick phase-out means really within the next 2 decades. And this is something which is very, very challenging, and it's very conflict-driven. So yes, we tried to do this in Germany, as I mentioned yesterday, to phase out coal production. But actually, first it will be in the 30s. Secondly, the corporation will be subsidized until then. Third, we have a neighbor producing 80% of its energy of coal, and the Poles will be happy to give us coal if we really want more coal. So there are a lot of shortcomings when it comes to phasing out these technologies. In addition to the huge lobbying power, we have to take the fifth argument into account, which I have mentioned, namely that divestment in brown assets could cause, I wouldn't say it must cause, but it could cause a huge financial bubble. If you do it abruptly, then it could cause a really mess. Therefore, it's so necessary to do it now, to start it now, to do it step by step. Then you will not have this bubble bursting. So financial investors are not crazy. They will not invest anymore in deep sea drilling if it's clear South African government want to go to 100% renewable technology. So stupid they are not. But if you do it, if you have to do it finally, because you know all the other, all the trajectory proves to be horrible, then you really risk, in addition to not having the new technology installed in time, then you really risk to get also a financial bubble which will have horrible impact on the economy. The sixth point are the so-called disruptive technologies. I will speak about this tomorrow. But what is actually, they have the same impact as renewable energy with regard to the resources, but what in addition comes up with this digitalization and artificial intelligence stuff, if you really allowed it to happen, that it might even change the very nature of humans. Because, you know, the idea where you can use artificial intelligence for which purpose, I will come back on this tomorrow, it's really frightening. So this should really make us very, very cautious with regard to this technology. And now I mentioned the technology you already brought into the discussion, geoengineering. Geoengineering, I have here the graphs, my last one, so that you see what the proposals are. Geoengineering is really about the last craziness of people. Anyway, even the International Panel of Climate Change, they now recommend one of these technologies. There are crazy ones. I give you an example of the crazy ones. But even the International Panel of Climate Change now recommend direct capture and storage of CO2 into the earth. So, meaning we simply should sit on CO2. Nobody has any idea what it would mean in terms of floods, in terms of thunderstorms, in terms of I don't know what. But this is really what you can read in the International Panel of Climate Change, because they are so sure. So I have not used my last graph yesterday because this is so frightening, this graph. It has been produced by, I think, 30 of the leading environmental institutes, Earth Science and Environmental Institute, last year, regarding, the threshold we are approaching in terms of climate change, in terms of hothouse scenarios. They don't speak anymore about warming. Global warming is simply ridiculous with regard to what they expect for the years to come. They speak about a hothouse scenario, and I feel a little bit pity that I couldn't use this graph. But before this background, what they expect as a development within the next 2 decades, and then expecting that it will no longer be stoppable, say, well, we have no other chance, well, we should do whatever we can in terms of renewable, blah, 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 but obviously we also have to think about technologies to store CO2 somewhere. It's absolutely ridiculous because it's a technology which is not really available, but they think that this will be part of the solution. But these engineers, now I have also the name, it's Jeffrey Sachs. Jeffrey Sachs from Columbia University, he wrote an article, a very small one, I guess it was in this online journal, Social Europe. It's true, it's time to call the engineers. That's the title of his article. Politicization will not fix the problem. So it's really the argument that these very strange technologies, so what is in the basket, it's obscuring the sun to reduce solar heat, and you can do it by suspending gas in the atmosphere, so actually creating the effects of a volcanic eruption, which is obviously something horrible, so no plant will grow. But the idea is, well, in some places where it's too hot, you could cool down the territory because, you prevent the sun from coming up. Preventing solar radiation is one of these ideas.
So it's basically putting a chemical umbrella over us.
Huh?
A chemical umbrella.
Sulfides, yes, absolutely toxic stuff. The other idea is to spray salt into the clouds. Yes, so that they rain us. Don't ask me what really the technology is behind. I simply give you some of these wonderful examples. There's also the idea of releasing micro bubbles in the oceans, or increasing the pollution of carbon-absorbing plankton, which is quite advanced. No idea how fishes could live there, So it's still fantasy, but unfortunately, a lot of engineers are really working on the issues. It's not that unfortunately, we have seen that human imagination really can create monsters. And so I do believe that for some countries, it might be really the idea, we cool it down, and obviously somewhere else it would be hotter then, but who cares? And this type of global apartheid system to be established via geoengineering stuff, still we can laugh about it a little bit, because it's not really advanced. But I'm afraid, you know, when I take into consideration, remember the time of World War II. This was a time when the atomic bomb was developed. You know, in times of high pressure, also technological advances are much quicker than in times where the pressure is less high. Therefore, even though I think it's crazy what they are doing, I do assume that, well, it might be the answer, given at least by the rich countries. It will not, definitely not solve anything, but it's still on the proposals. So my third kind of conclusion is, well, in addition to the technological shortages we have with regard to the green capitalism, we have also to take other constraints into account. I don't want to elaborate here broadly on it, but going back on what we have discussed yesterday, so there are constraints of the market structure. The market is dominated by big corporations, and they are able to enforce pressure on governments, as well as in trade unions, as well as on workers, to resist the necessary change. So we have to be aware that there is huge resistance coming from those market structures. They will still go ahead to externalize cost whenever they can. And this example here, you know, externalizing cost means driving energy cost very highly, so it will impact on somebody, but not on the energy corporations, obviously. Massive subsidization of fossil fuel intensive industries. At least the rich countries can afford to do this. So we subsidize our energy consuming industries, the car industry, the machinery industry, the chemical industry. Poor countries cannot subsidize their industries. So again, we will get a split, but therefore green economy really would need, in order to make the shift, to deal with these market structures. But even more important, I think, are the financial constraints. Financial constraints in so far as I mentioned yesterday, the investors are the ones who are pushing productive capital to generate surplus, and this always means to increase production beyond all needs. It has nothing to do with use value, that we are, well, somehow forced by marketing, by advertisement, to buying stuff which is, well, to substitute stuff which is already functioning, but it's a precondition for capitalism, and therefore investors are pressuring corporations to take away the last product in order to place a new one, and convince consumers that they have to buy it in order to keep the machinery running. Secondly, financial investors or the financial market have a preference for short-term interest. Short-term today even means a quarter, you know, a quarter where you have to report whether your business is producing profits. Otherwise it will be split and part of the firms will be sold. But you know, for the green change which would be necessary, we would need long-term perspective, you know, longer-term perspective. Green technologies really can pay off, can be even something like a bargain in capitalist terms, but not in the short term. Not in the short term. You need 20 years, something like this. You cannot say, well, I invest today and tomorrow I will get as much profit out of, let's say, this business as I got out so far from the car industry and my shares in the car industry. But investors are pressing for this short-term interest, and they are very reluctant to finance long-term business which still would make sense in the capitalist meanings. Plus, they are risk adverse. They really don't like to risk something. They have a preference for incremental change, so step by step by step. But the problem is we don't have time anymore. So incremental change, this was yesterday. We haven't done the change yesterday. We have not organized the change yesterday. So today we really need quite risky and quite quick changes, and no longer the incremental one. And finally, yes, there are still the systemic limits of the green transformation. I don't have to repeat it now. Constant accumulation of capital is inherent in our economy. Economic agents are forced to undercut the others and to conquer market by creating new products. So I would say there are a number of constraints why green hopes, and green hopes mean to stay within the system and nevertheless organize a transition. This would be, from my point of view, is very unlikely. So what instead would be necessary, I would argue, to move beyond capitalism while still following a green route would be, as minimum requirements, let's say minimum requirements, first an increase of reuse of all kinds of materials and recycling as well where it's possible. But what would be equally necessary would be very effective, tough regulations to force large corporations to design their equipment in a way that it makes it easy to disassemble the materials contained. Because companies will not do it voluntarily. You have to force them, you know. They will not do it on a voluntary basis. So, but at least reusing, recycling would be the most important step. And this could be done even within, I would say, capitalist conditions, except that you have to force the corporation to do so. I usually use, when I'm discussing this with my students, an example that, well, it's not so difficult to force somebody to something which is rational, and a majority of people can see that it's rational. So I've been a smoker, a strong smoker in the 90s. And I've been from the first time I was in the United States, and I said to myself and to my friends, kind of like, this would be never possible in Germany, that smokers are forced to stay outside, even when it's very, very cold. Never in my lifetime will I see something like this happen in Germany or in Italy and other European cities. Well, it was very, very easy. You know, there was once a decision taken, and now smoking is forbidden in all the restaurants and all the universities and all public institutions and all the stations. And actually, because it was a rational decision, everybody could follow it, you know. Yes, now those poor smokers, you really can feel pity for them. They have now to stand in little boxes, you know. It's really, you can really feel pity for them. But, you know, nobody is really smoking anymore. Well, there are some still people smoking. But, you know, it was so easy to pass this through, even though I also have believed that it will be never possible. So therefore, I think, you know, you can use strong instruments as well if it makes sense for the people that you use it, and not that it's not an instrument of, you know, privileging these and not these people and so on. And the second minimum requirement, I would say, that peaceful transformation from brown to green, from a brown to a greener capitalism, because I'm now still in the capitalist approach. Yes, I would like to move beyond, but I'm still in this approach. Let's have a green capitalism. A peaceful transformation toward a greener capitalism would depend, I would argue, on government investment that embrace public purposes of the public domain. And for this to happen, government revenues, obviously from a smaller budget, because if there's less growth, there will be a smaller government budget as well, would have to go to a bigger amount to collective consumption, and less would be available for individual consumption. Collective consumption and so forth as rebuilding, reshaping public infrastructure would be in the center. So that, yes, healthcare, education, transport, all this would be in a better shape, but this would obviously have to go hand in hand with less individual income available. There is always a possibility to compensate the poor, but it would mean for the middle classes that they have to live with less individual income, and the rich we have to tax anyway. You know, we have to tax away the rich, the wealth of the rich, because this is a precondition that government would be able to do what is necessary, even within, staying within this frame of, well, having then a greener capitalism. But actually, this would also mean for the individuals that we have to live a much simpler life, to be clear about this. And it will also implicate that more physical work has to be done, less electronic and digital work. So refitting, rebuilding, reshaping already existing infrastructure, houses, institutions do need skilled labor, but only to a minor extent, I would argue. Well, digitalization can somehow support this. But the idea, you know, which is very famous in Europe, you know, when you speak there about this type of changes, you know, you have among the green parties, you have, they are so enthusiastic about digitalization in combination with the greener capitalism, because they are talking about the smart houses where you can control your energy consumption via digital equipment so that you reduce the heating and then bring heating against up, or the lighting will be adequate to different needs. This is the idea, you know, with more technology, more consumption of metals, you will have then less energy consumption, which is absolutely crazy, because on the balance, this will not help us. So it would mean, yes, a more simpler way of life, because, and it would mean that we have to do more repair work, more maintenance, and we would need different kind of education system, not promising the young people that they will sit for the lifetime in front of a computer and simply typing and things will happen somehow. No, it would mean really skilled work, physical work, and this is not a charming message. I know that kids and young people across the world, no matter whether they are living in Germany or in Brazil, want to become YouTubers, influencers, gamers, and much more of these interesting, promising activities they have in mind. But actually this is something what education system also have to correct in order to clarify what it would mean. I don't know, no, it's now 5 o'clock, right? So maybe I have now, as the last part, I will not give it because I want to stay in time. There are 3 more slides. I will not comment on these slides now, but since I have been asked for the slides, I will give you, I will send it to you, and no, you will have to download it. What I have done in the last part is to formulate some normative, some goals, which from my perspective could bridge the constellation where we are, which is capitalism, to something which is beyond capitalism, at least as we know it. Whether we later will call it a new type of municipal socialism of the 21st century, or whether one find another word for it, I don't really care. But I gave you some hints. Unfortunately, I cannot elaborate on this, but if you like, you can discuss it without me, because maybe they are not self-explaining in a way, but maybe you have some ideas. I want to stay now in time, and I apologize for not being able to go through all these slides. At least This one point I want to mention. I gave there some norms and objectives and goals. I think one could negotiate these goals in each society in a peaceful way. Nevertheless, and therefore I put it here in red. And many of these instruments, which we can discuss about, have one precondition, namely intervention in private property right. Because many of these decisions you cannot take when you leave property rights as they are today, and therefore, yes, it's still about power. It's still about the question how to break the power of capital, and therefore, even though my ideas, which I have developed in the 3 slides before, from my perspective, can be realized somehow or transformed in a peaceful way, I'm not that sure that a peaceful transformation is possible. So it might be the case that I would say it's 50 to 50. We must hope that we still have the possibility to change things in the next 20 years so that a violent way of trying to get things changed can be avoided, but I'm not that sure that this is the case. So I would say we have to have the hope in order to prevent it, otherwise it will be something like a very chaotic form of transition. But that one thing I'm sure there will be a transition. Thank you for